Jung's interest in the subject of astrology was informed by his Darwinian influences, as seen by his conceptualization of the archetype. Whereas the gene refers to biological replicators in the process of evolution by natural selection, and Dawkins' meme refers to cultural replicators, artificially or memetically selected in cultural evolution. Jung's archetype fits somewhere between the two, referring to underlying behavioral patterns, which constitute and are encoded in such mimetic cultural replicators, represented at a general, universal, and therefore necessarily somewhat low-detail level of abstraction. In the case of parents, for example, there are different genes for fertility, metabolism, and life expectancy, different memes for early childhood care, and archetypal behavioral patterns associated with figures such as the wise old man, which are loosely associative and contiguous with other thematic groupings and generalizations, such as tropes, motifs, and stereotypes. The archetype is by definition somewhat amorphous, but can be defined against what it is not. As we have discussed, it's a more general concept than the meme. Specifically, it is differentiated from more general thematic groupings in that it is by definition universal in nature rather than culturally specific, and because it is primordial insofar as it transcends levels of technological development across societies to a significant extent. The Pied Piper, for example, is not an archetype itself, but a fictional character which possesses or represents archetypal qualities, such as those of the trickster, which is a Jungian archetype. On the other hand, the archetype is also differentiated from Platonic ideas or forms, in that whilst they are universal, they are not perfect or ideal distillations of general characteristics, but appear to individuals in their waking and dream states, in the form of popular representations in contemporary culture, like the Pied Piper, or as real people with their archetypal qualities exaggerated. The archetype is the trickster or the hero as such, neither any particular hero figure nor an undifferentiated hero ideal. A higher-level abstraction again was coined by Dawkins, the memeplex or meme complex, which refers to whole belief systems, social organizations, rituals or ceremonies, composed of memes which reliably group together and get inherited as a cultural package. The archetype is a bit like a smaller, more individualized version of the memeplex. It's also important to note that Jung was at pains to expose the limitations and weaknesses of his arguments when they ventured into speculative, interdisciplinary areas, and saw his task as revealing important areas for further research, rather than advocating any particular position. Jung considered many of his core psychological concepts critical, rational improvements over neoplatonic ideas, the clearest example being his archetypes, which are characteristically designated as originating in the psyche, as opposed to Plato's forms, which were said to originate in the world or heavens outside of the mind. Unlike Plato, Jung's archetypes don't necessitate more than one terrestrial world to explain them, and don't posit or suggest additional worlds, except for the metaphorical division between the actual world, as it unfolds, and possible worlds of potential experience, which may or may not come to pass. Like the ancient church fathers had done in constructing medieval scholasticism, Jung synthesized elements from both Plato and Aristotle, though he was closer to Aristotle's more agnostic logic when dealing with Platonic issues. Archetype derives from the Latin archetypum, meaning roughly the original or primitive model. As we discussed, the archetype is a priori in that it exists prior to conceptualization or experience, self-similar insofar as they resemble themselves universally in representations such as mandalas, and are therefore considered to exist in the background world of potential human behavior, given that it consists of what repeatedly emerges from this background of potential. Jung's description of the archetype as the self-portrait of the instinct hints at a genomic basis beyond mere memes, and raises further questions for later episodes. Synchronicity refers to events which appear to human subjects to be paralleling one another, or to be ordered acausally, owing to their being connected by meaning subjectively, whilst lacking an objective causal connection. Its association with archetypes was clearly manifest for Jung in both dream analysis and mythic systems such as astrology. According to Jung, astrology was a, quote, naively projected psychology in which the different attitudes and temperaments of man are represented as gods and identified with planets and zodiacal constellations. This understanding of astrology as an unconscious act of psychological projection was Jung's most consistent definition of astrology, but not the only one. He also considered it psychology in its oldest form, representing the sum of all psychological knowledge of antiquity, and therefore indispensable for a proper understanding of mythology. Although he was interested in the divinatory aspect of the system, he rejected what he called the superstitious use of astrological prediction, quote, beyond psychological possibilities, as false. Finally, its archetypal properties made Jung see astrology as synchronicity on a grand scale, mapping transformations or movements of archetypal constellations in the collective unconscious, by way of human beings seeing their inner psychological world mirrored back to them in the symbolic system they had projected onto the stars' movements. According to this perspective, the astrologer is technically working under a delusion, confusing psychological causes with cosmological or metaphysical ones, but could therefore potentially provide psychological insights insofar as the archetypal constellations it identified, such as Saturn or Aquarius, actually reside in, or accurately refer to properties residing in, the psyche. Jung's interest, therefore, was directed toward the mundane side of astrology, that is, the mythic analysis of historic events and personages, and specifically in what an analysis of this tradition may imply about the nature and function of the collective unconscious in coloring our perceptions of history. His writings on astrology generally eschew the kind of weekly or monthly horoscopic astrology popularized in newspapers during his lifetime, which when taken literally as a form of divination, he considered superstitious and rejected, since he ascribed no causal influence over human life to planetary bodies. Finally, his notion of enantiodromia, that is, the tendency of natural and psychic properties to change into their opposites under certain conditions over time, was something of a bedrock for his psychology, underlying the aforementioned ideas, as well as the shadow, anima and animus, and others not discussed here. It had a forerunner in the medieval ideas of magical correspondences between material and heavenly substances, insofar as both seek to explain how apparently disparate phenomena are related to one another and often nested inside the same overarching system. Jung's idea, however, ultimately has more in common with Darwinian cosmology than with theological or occult worldviews. These similarities to occult and theological ideas, discussed openly by Jung himself, has influenced some critics of Jung and psychoanalysis in general, who have accused him of attempting to reconcile irreconcilable opposites, specifically science and religion, and of creating a new, syncretistic religious worldview, or at least bolstering the New Age movement, under the guise of an apparently neutral or objective social science. Whilst that debate is too complex to discuss in detail here, it is a possible tension worth keeping in mind as we discuss these sources.